August 1944. The air was thick with smoke and the distant rumble of artillery as the Wehrmacht troops scrambled across the shattered fields near Falaise. Germany's front was collapsing, and retreating units left behind what they could not carry. Among the debris, a group of mechanics from a battered Wehrmacht maintenance unit stumbled upon a vehicle unlike any they had seen before. It was a GMC CCKW, an American Deuce-and-a-Half, abandoned on the side of the road. At first glance, it seemed like just another truck, but as they approached, a quiet awe settled over the group. These were men who had spent years maintaining German half-tracks and trucks, accustomed to the delicate engineering of the Opel Blitz or the cumbersome SD-KFZ vehicles. But the design of this American truck hinted at something different, something more. The GMC CCKW was deceptively simple, yet robust in every way. The mechanics pried open the cab and checked the engine, marveling at the neat arrangement of parts, each labeled and easy to replace. The spark plugs, the wiring, the suspension, every component seemed engineered for reliability under harsh conditions. One mechanic noted how quickly the engine could be disassembled and reassembled, a task that would have taken hours on many German vehicles. Even the tires, fitted for all-terrain, seemed designed with foresight. As they poked around the truck bed, they found a toolkit that was basic but complete, and spare parts stowed in a way that made repairs in the field almost trivial. It was the kind of vehicle that could run miles of rough, muddy roads without breaking down, carrying supplies to the front line while German logistics struggled to keep pace. As they examined the truck, a deeper realization began to dawn. Each part of the GMC spoke not just of clever engineering, but of mass production, standardization, and the scale of resources that had gone into it. This was a truck designed to be built quickly, in large numbers, and to be operated by soldiers who might have minimal mechanical training. Germany had vehicles that were technically impressive, but many were complex and prone to mechanical failure. The Americans, by contrast, had perfected the art of making machines that worked, even in the hands of unskilled operators. For these mechanics, staring at this abandoned truck, the implications were unsettling. They tried to calculate in their minds the number of these vehicles that could be produced in a single month, then a single year. They realized that even if Germany pushed its factories to full capacity, it could never match the scale, speed, and efficiency of American production. Every part they examined was standardized, interchangeable, and designed to last. The truck wasn't just a marvel of engineering, it was a symbol of an industrial juggernaut moving at full force. It carried with it the invisible weight of America's factories, steel mills, and assembly lines. In that moment, the war didn't feel like it was being lost on distant battlefields, but right here, in the quiet realization that the tools of victory were already far beyond Germany's reach. The mechanics started talking in low voices, almost afraid that the sound of their own words would shatter the truth. They had seen the Allied supply convoys before, the endless columns of trucks, jeeps, and tanks rolling relentlessly through France. Now, touching this single vehicle, they understood what those columns represented. Not just men and machines, but a nation's full industrial might focused on one goal. It was not fear exactly, but a sobering recognition that Germany was running out of time and that the enemy's advantage extended far beyond the battlefield. As they finished their inspection, the mechanics climbed back into their own vehicles, leaving the GMC where it lay. Yet none of them forgot what they had seen. In quiet moments, later that evening around campfires and in whispered conversations, they would recount the details of the truck, each fact amplifying the truth. America could build more trucks in a week than Germany could in a month, and each one could carry soldiers, ammunition, and supplies across terrain that would cripple German vehicles. The simplicity, durability, and scale of the GMC CCKW was more than a lesson in engineering. It was proof that the war was already shifting irreversibly against them, long before the battles were won or lost. The mechanics couldn't stop thinking about the truck they had discovered near Falaise. The more they examined it,
the more they realized that the GMC CCKW was not just a vehicle, it was a lesson in American ingenuity. They opened the hood again, tracing the engine's layout with their fingers, noting how cleanly the components were arranged. Every bolt, every pipe, every lever seemed designed with a purpose. Unlike many German vehicles, which often required specialized tools or long hours of tinkering, this engine could be serviced quickly, even in the mud and chaos of the front lines. One of the mechanics started checking the suspension, marveling at how each part absorbed shocks while remaining easy to replace. They ran their hands along the axles and the drive shaft, discovering that everything was built not just to perform, but to endure. The tires were made for versatility, able to handle soft mud, rocky trails, and even shallow water crossings without failure. They realized that the truck could be loaded heavily with ammunition or food and still reach units that German supply trucks might never see. It was built to keep moving, and in war, movement was everything. Inside the cab, the controls were simple and intuitive. There were no unnecessary gauges, no overly complex systems. The driver could focus on the road ahead rather than wrestling with the machine. The mechanics tried sitting behind the wheel, imagining themselves driving it across the French countryside, and were struck by how easily the truck could be managed, even by someone with minimal experience. Every part they touched seemed to whisper a message. This vehicle was built to work for the people who needed it most, without demanding extraordinary skill or luck. As they explored the truck bed, they discovered the way spare parts were stowed. Nuts, bolts, and essential components were packed neatly and labeled, ready for rapid replacement. There was even a small portable toolkit, compact but complete, designed for field repairs. The mechanics exchanged glances, realizing that this attention to detail was not random. It reflected a whole system, a philosophy of making machines that could survive in war without slowing down the war effort itself. They began comparing it silently with the trucks they maintained for Germany. Even the most reliable German models required constant attention and maintenance. Repairs could take hours, sometimes days, and often depended on the skill of the mechanic and the availability of scarce parts. This truck, by contrast, seemed to anticipate every possible challenge. It was modular, simple, and almost self-sufficient in its design. It was the kind of engineering that didn't just solve a problem, it prevented problems from ever becoming critical. The realization weighed heavily on the men. They were not just looking at a truck, they were looking at the embodiment of American industrial philosophy. Mass production, standardization, and durability were written into every inch of this vehicle. The GMC was not a luxury, it was a weapon of war in its own right, silently moving men and supplies in a way that no single tank or artillery piece could. Each truck represented thousands of hours of design, manufacturing, and planning, all focused on keeping the Allied armies supplied and mobile. By the time they climbed down from the truck, the mechanics were quiet, lost in thought. They had handled many vehicles in their careers, but none had carried the weight of strategic power the way this one did. This single CCKW truck was a small piece of a massive machine, and yet it told them more about the state of the war than any report or intelligence briefing ever could. The simplicity, durability, and foresight baked into every component was a reminder that the Americans were not fighting just with soldiers, they were fighting with an entire industrial ecosystem, and Germany was increasingly struggling to match it. In that quiet field near Falaise, the truth became undeniable. The war was being won in factories thousands of miles away, and the GMC CCKW was proof of it. As the mechanics reflected on the GMC truck, their minds began to stretch beyond the immediate battlefield. This was not just an impressive piece of machinery, It was a small window into the scale of American industry. While Germany struggled to keep factories running under constant Allied bombing, the United States had mobilized an industrial machine of unprecedented power. The CCKW truck was the most visible example of a much larger reality. The Americans could build thousands of vehicles, tanks, and weapons faster than Germany could even repair or deploy its own. The scale was staggering. By 1944, American factories were producing hundreds of thousands of trucks, jeeps, and tanks every year. The assembly lines in Detroit, Toledo, and Cleveland were humming day and night, churning out machines designed for reliability and interchangeability. Every component was standardized, every process optimized, and every worker trained to ensure maximum output. Meanwhile, German factories were under constant threat of bombing raids, struggling with material shortages, and often forced to rely on forced labor with little experience or morale. The contrast was clear. The Americans were producing strength by the thousands, while Germany was losing strength piece by piece. It wasn't just about numbers. Each truck, each jeep, and each tank could be repaired in the field with relative ease. American engineers had designed vehicles so that even a soldier with minimal training could replace a tire, fix an engine part, or improvise repairs. German vehicles, by contrast, were often more technically sophisticated but far less forgiving. A broken transmission or a single missing component could immobilize a tank or truck, and replacements were not always available. This meant that while German forces were often stalled by mechanical failures, American supply lines continued to flow with remarkable reliability. The mechanics thought back to the columns of Allied trucks they had seen moving across France. These weren't isolated vehicles. They were a river of industrial power, carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements. The sheer scale of American logistics created a strategic advantage that no battlefield maneuver alone could overcome. Every GMC truck was a small cog in a massive machine, and each cog was nearly impossible for Germany to stop. The more they considered it, the more they realized that the truck they had inspected was not an exception, it was typical. Thousands of identical vehicles, built to last, were pushing the Allies ever closer to victory. Even the design philosophy behind these vehicles reflected a deep understanding of war. The Americans focused on simplicity, modularity, and durability, knowing that in combat, vehicles would face mud, snow, shell craters, and careless handling. Each part was standardized, which meant that repairs could be made quickly, often with parts scavenged from other vehicles. This approach turned American trucks into mobile factories of their own, able to deliver supplies across a continent in chaos. German forces, reliant on slower, more fragile logistics, could never match that tempo. By the end of the day, the mechanics began to feel the full weight of what they had witnessed. It wasn't just a matter of one truck, one engine, or one clever design. It was a reflection of an entire nation's capacity to wage war. The GMC CCKW truck represented thousands more in assembly lines rolling out every month, all ready to keep the Allied armies moving. In that moment, near the fields of Falaise, the reality became undeniable. Germany could fight bravely, but it could not overcome the combined force of American production, standardization, and industrial ingenuity. The war, the mechanics realized, was already being lost long before the battles were fought, in factories far from the front lines, one truck at a time.
By the time the sun began to set over the fields near Falaise, the group of Wehrmacht mechanics was unusually quiet. Normally, they joked, complained, and swapped stories while repairing vehicles or waiting for orders. But today, there was a weight in the air that none of them could shake. The GMC truck they had discovered earlier was no longer just an object of curiosity. It had become a symbol. As they sat around their own battered vehicles, they began to talk in low voices, each man piecing together the implications of what they had seen. It started with small observations. One mechanic mentioned how quickly the American truck could be repaired in the field, even under extreme conditions. Another noted the clever arrangement of spare parts and tools designed to anticipate problems before they became serious. Slowly, a picture began to form. This single truck was part of a system that Germany simply could not match. Every part of the GMC spoke of preparation, planning, and industrial capacity. The Americans had not just built a truck, they had built hundreds of thousands of trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles designed to keep an army moving no matter the conditions. They began to compare this to their own experiences. German vehicles, while often technically sophisticated, were fragile by comparison. They required constant attention, spare parts were scarce, and repairs could take hours or even days. A single breakdown could halt an entire column, delay supplies, and put soldiers at risk. In contrast, the Americans had anticipated every challenge, designing vehicles that could be maintained quickly and keep moving. The realization hit hard. Germany's tactical skill on the battlefield could not compensate for the industrial gap. Every victory would be temporary, every gain precarious, because the Americans could replace men, machines, and supplies faster than Germany could destroy them. The conversation grew more somber as they reflected on the scale of production. By 1944, the United States was producing more trucks in a single month than Germany could manufacture in a year. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft followed similar patterns: reliability, quantity, and speed. Even if Germany deployed its best forces with precision, the relentless flow of Allied supplies would eventually overwhelm them. The mechanics realized that they were witnessing the power of logistics as a weapon, a force far more decisive than any single engagement. It was an invisible front, fought not with bullets but with steel, assembly lines, and strategic planning. As darkness fell, they thought about the men they had fought alongside and against. How could they hope to match a nation whose every vehicle, every bullet, every piece of equipment was designed for maximum efficiency and resilience? They understood with a growing sense of dread that the war was being lost in ways that had nothing to do with courage or tactics. Even the most disciplined units could not hold back an opponent who could replenish, repair, and reinforce faster than Germany could respond. The GMC truck was just one example, but it told the story of the larger reality. German industry was straining, stretched to its limits, and the Allies had already built the tools of victory. The mechanics sat in silence, staring at the faint outlines of the truck in the fading light. It was more than a vehicle now. It was a reminder of a harsh truth. They had fought for years, believing in strategy, skill, and honor, yet they could see clearly that these virtues were not enough. Victory was no longer just a matter of winning battles. It was about sustaining the army, keeping it supplied, and maintaining momentum. The Americans had mastered all three, and Germany, despite courage and ingenuity, was falling behind. By the end of that day, each mechanic carried the quiet weight of realization. The war was slipping from their grasp, and the small abandoned truck in Falaise had silently delivered the cruelest message. Germany was doomed.
As the months passed, the abandoned GMC truck near Falaise became a story whispered among the mechanics, a symbol of what they had witnessed and what they could not ignore. It was a reminder that the war was not only being fought on the front lines, but also in factories, assembly plants, and workshops far from the battlefields. The small, reliable truck they had seen was part of a much larger American machine, one that Germany could not hope to match. Every bolt, Every spare part, every simple yet durable feature reflected a nation's ability to sustain war on a scale unimaginable to the Wehrmacht. Historians would later look back at stories like this one and see a pattern repeated across Europe. American industrial power was relentless. The U.S. produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, and tens of thousands of aircraft and tanks, all standardized, reliable, and ready for combat. Each truck rolling down a French road carried not just supplies, but the weight of an entire nation's effort and ingenuity. For the mechanics who had seen that first GMC up close, the implications were immediate. No matter how skilled, brave, or disciplined German forces might be, they could not outpace the production and logistical power of the United States. The GMC CCKW was more than a truck. It was a symbol of modern warfare, where industrial capacity became as decisive as strategy or tactics. Each vehicle, each part, and each repair kit reflected lessons learned from years of preparation, testing, and refinement. The Americans understood that war was not just about winning battles, it was about being able to keep fighting, day after day, mile after mile, without running out of men, fuel, or tools. The mechanics realized that German victories could only be temporary. The tide of supply and production would inevitably overwhelm them. Even in quiet moments, long after the battlefields of France had moved behind them, the men recalled the details of the truck, the simple controls, the durable engine, the spare parts cleverly packed and labeled. All of it made sense as a piece of a much larger system. They began to see the war not as a series of engagements, but as a competition of resources, planning, and industrial ingenuity. The Americans had mastered these forces, and Germany had been stretched to the breaking point. In that light, the Falaise truck was no longer a curiosity, it was a prophecy. Modern historians often cite the GMC CCKW as one of the unsung heroes of the war. It was part of a supply network that enabled rapid advances, sustained armies in the field, and allowed the Allies to maintain momentum when German forces were forced into retreat. Each truck, jeep, or armored vehicle produced in the United States represented more than material. It was a reflection of a society mobilized for total war, capable of replacing losses quickly and keeping the front moving relentlessly forward. The mechanics' discovery was a small but revealing window into this reality. By the time Germany surrendered less than a year later, the lessons of the GMC CCKW had been proven beyond doubt. Battles could be won and cities defended, but the war was increasingly being decided far from the front lines, in factories and assembly plants, where production, standardization, and logistics created an unstoppable force. For the Wehrmacht mechanics, the truth they had glimpsed in that abandoned truck was finally clear. Germany had not simply been defeated on the battlefield, it had been outproduced, outplanned, and outpaced. The quiet, rugged GMC CCKW had delivered its message in the most unassuming way possible. Strength built on industry would win the war, and no amount of courage could overcome the gap. As we look back today, the story reminds us of the hidden battles that shape history. It teaches that innovation, planning, and production can be as decisive as strategy and bravery. One small truck, abandoned in the fields of Falaise, became a story of an unstoppable industrial force, a lesson that was clear to the men who touched it, and one that still resonates for anyone who studies the power of logistics, engineering, and foresight in shaping the outcome of war. In the end, the GMC CCKW was more than metal and wheels. It was a silent witness to history, a testament to the fact that the course of the Second World War was decided not only by guns and tanks, but by the extraordinary capacity of a nation to produce, supply, and sustain its forces across continents.